Since 1968, the African Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem have lived in the state of Israel. Guided by their leader, the late Ben Ami Ben Israel, the group left the United States and, after a brief period in Liberia, settled in Dimona, a city in southern Israel. There, they have lived for more than 50 years, and during that time, the group has battled the state for respect, for recognition, for work visas, and even citizenship. Over time, after intense struggle, the Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem, the African Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem, have improved their relationship with the state. And in 2003, the government finally granted them legal citizenship, or some got permanent or temporary residency. Everyone there who was living there got that. Like other Israeli citizens and other American settlers, which they are, the group's children serve in the Israeli military. And the group is now generally celebrated as valuable members of Israeli society, rather than the strange vegan cult from Chicago that they were labeled when they first arrived in the 1960s. So the problem is solved, or so they thought. It turns out that not everybody living there was included in the 2003 decision. Instead, some have been living in Israel without any legal status for decades. And although they have applied for residency in order to fix the problem, those requests have now been formally denied. Last week, 46 families received deportation notices from Israel's Population and Immigration Authority. Now, according to the deportation order, all of them must leave the country within 60 days. This includes people who have lived there for decades, and it also includes children who have never lived anywhere else. So why this decision? And why now? And what can be done about it? Well, to answer that question, I sat down with Sar Ahmadiel Bem Yehuda. He's the Minister of Information for the African Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem. And since he is currently observing the Sabbath, I caught up with him earlier today. Ahmadiel, good to see you as always. Talk to me about what's going on here. Last week, members of your community got letters from the state of Israel saying that they weren't going to be granted citizenship and had to be deported. How and why?
Thanks again, Mark. Always good to talk with you. The Ministry of Interior here, we had been in negotiation with them over the last few years, several years actually, and more intensively over the last maybe about 6 months ago, over the lingering status issues regarding maybe a couple dozen of families here. And it dates back to when we had made an agreement with the state back when we were incurring lots of problems back all the way from our arrival in 1969 all the way up until 1990. And in 1990, the ministry, led by Aryeh Deri, the current Minister of Interior, who then later went to jail and then has returned and is back in that same office, he approached us, and long story short, we normalized our relations. We were able to redocument ourselves as American citizens because we had, in large, in mass, renounced to make ourselves stateless and therefore undeportable. And we were on a path of permanent residency, temporary residency, permanent residency, and on to citizenship. That process went through pretty much 90% of the community, but there were also, in this lull of inactivity and inaction and indecision on the part of the ministry, there were several families who did not go through that process, and so we wanted to regularize.
One second, why didn't they go through the process? Because that's part of the question here, and just for the audience's sake, so the community begins to move there to the southern region of Israel. There's a battle over citizenship. Ultimately, you come to an agreement where the state says, I believe in 2003, hey, we're going to give everybody in the community permanent residency. Some people even got citizenship after military service from their children, but some people didn't get that deal. These aren't newcomers. These aren't people who came after the deal was made. These people were there when the deal was made, right?
Some of them actually did come later, but again, we wanted to simply bring them up, and they might have been family members. There's all different types of scenarios involved here. There's not a one-size-fits-all scenario. Some came and had family here already and wanted to be reunited with them. Some were not active with the community and had gone away during the time of the agreement and did not try to take advantage of that particular option at that particular time. But all of these cases were known to the Ministry of Interior because we had actually put their names on a list and actually began a process, and we had gotten early indications that this would have been taken care of. But again, it drug out. And when we pressed it a few months ago, again, we got an indication that we can resolve this. And so for them to get these letters last week was quite a surprise to us. At disappointment, and certainly is not what we expected in the least.
60 days is what they told you have before you get deported. These are people who have lived there, in some cases, for decades, no? I mean, 60 days seems like a relatively short window.
We're talking about people who have been here for between 25 and 15 years at the least. And of course, in our community, because of our closeness, you've got to know that we're extremely intertwined. They're an integral part of the community, absolutely. The 60 days is the time that they would have to get out, but there is a clause that says within 21 days that they can appeal. Our initial response is certainly to make that appeal, which then would remove that particular clock and set another clock.
Help me understand why this is happening in the first place. You all started making the transition from Liberia to the state of Israel in 1968. Many arrived also in 1969. And you were doing what many people were doing around the world who identified with the law of return, which said that Israel's law of return said that Jews anywhere in the world could return home and gain citizenship. We saw people from Yemen, from Morocco, from Eastern Europe, from Western Europe, and of course we saw American settlers arrive there as well. What was it about your community, the African Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem? What is it about your community that caused you to face such challenges with the Department of Interior, and with the Department of Aliyah or Immigration?
There were two individuals that came in 68. One was left behind. That was our pioneer, Prince Kiskiyahu, who was left here to actually embed himself in the society, to learn the lay of the land, and to be here to assist in the absorption of the larger remaining group that were in Liberia. So when the 138, in fact, they came in about 3 or 4 waves in 1969, the initial response, the initial welcome was indeed that they were accepted under the then law of return. Curiously, 9 months later, and retroactively, the law of return was rewritten. And so the new definition of who was a Jew and therefore entitled to return and be part of this society was rewritten in such a way that defined us out. Historically, within the Ministry of Interior, there have been the 2 R's. There's the race and there's the religion. Israel's not unique in that globally race can be a factor about these matters, and race certainly is a factor within the Interior Ministry. It is recognized by some other observers here. They may grimace and recoil from the use of the terminology. They don't like to have that label applied, but nevertheless, it is actually the reality here. The other R is religion. We do not ascribe to the tenets of the religion of Judaism. We are a spiritual people, not a religious people. And so that makes the fact that rabbinate here with veil keepers, they are the gatekeepers. They control the Ministry of Interior because of the instability of governments for the last several decades. They normally go for the deal to hold the portfolio of Interior.
Ahmadiel, let me pause you for 1 second. I want to be clear for my audience. So because Israel is a Jewish state, the conditions of being able to return to the country or to live in the country as a full citizen hinge upon being accepted as a returning Jewish person. The Department of the Rabbinate, which is a religious body, is also shaping the Department of Interior. In other words, who determines immigration are the same people who determine whether or not you can identify as a Jew. And so when groups of people have come to Israel, part of the challenge has been determining whether or not they are true Jews. And so whether it's people coming from Russia, whether it's the Beta Israel people, or what some people wrongly call Falashins from Ethiopia, when they make Aliyah to Israel, the question is, are you really Jewish? And so Ahmadiel, what it sounds like your community is facing is a question of, are you Jewish enough, or are you sufficiently Jewish in order to be members of this community? Now, the state of Israel would say, you don't identify as Jewish, and even though you follow certain rites and traditions, you're not Jewish, so why should you get citizenship in a Jewish state?
We identify as Jewish only in the sense that we are Judeans. We insist that our Hebraic Israelite identity is our national identity, which links us to this land and region, but our tribal affiliation is indeed Judah or Yehuda, which then makes us Jewish in that context. But that is not context, obviously, that the religious authorities recognize. The problem is that the Ministry of Interior can be very, very creative in providing opportunities and windows and definitions that allow, for example, Soviet Jews to fit within the framework of the law of return and are allowed. But that creativity is diminished and, in fact, non-existent when it comes to those of us who have a darker complexion and that particular affinity. And that's the word that they try to use, which is very offensive, that people who have an affinity with Judaism or the Jewish state, we actually say that our genetics, our migration patterns, our cultural connections are authentically linking us back to this land. It's not something that we cooked up or is imagined. We actually can trace our roots back to this land, and that's something that anthropologists are now beginning to come on our side and advocate for. But nevertheless, it's not widely recognized, and it's a great fear on the part of the religious authorities that we represent that we think is behind this.
Well, why now? I mean, you all have been here since the 60s. There were incredible battles and standoffs. The show of strength in the 80s. There were moments where we thought things could get really bad, but at some point, you all were in good standing with the Israeli government. You all were taking pictures with prime ministers. They called you now kind of a rose, blooming in the Negev desert. I mean, it sounded like everything was good. Why would the government now make a different choice? If you all are playing by the rules, your children are joining the military. If you're doing all the things that people do when they're Israeli, essentially settlers, and of course I have a critique of that, but if you all are playing by all the rules as everybody else, and you've always been black, and you've always been quote unquote different, why do you think they're waiting until the year 2021 to decide suddenly to make this decision?
It speaks to an element within the Ministry of Interior, and we're not sure if it is at the highest government level or is the administration of popular affairs, which is populated, heavily invested with the religious right-wing elements of the community. It is that element that has always been a thorn in our side here. That's not something unique. When we go back in our history, we've always had brothers and sisters in the community, whether they're Moroccan, be from the Ashkenazi side or the Mizrahi side. Generally, we get along very well. Our children have served in the IDF. And of course, that has, when you have 300-400 children who've been embedded in the IDF, that institution, of course, we're well known in the TV and in the media, performing arts and what have you, photography exhibits. We're well known in that particular sphere. We put veganism on the map in Israel. They used to call us a vegan cult, but they had to remove the cult part because now veganism is very popular in Israel. So why now? I don't know. Maybe it was a trial balloon to see if now was an opportune time to uproot us or to disrupt our growth and progress. Ultimately, it does boil down to a great fear, an irrational fear based on the R word, the racial element. We can't deny the awakening. You know yourself, Mark, that in the States, probably the largest and most dynamic growth mechanism within the religious communities is that of Hebrew Israelites coming out of the church. And with that understanding and awakening and looking here, when you look at the Igbo, there's 40 million Igbo in Nigeria. And so there's a reluctance to accept them legitimately as connected to this land. There's a reluctance to accept the Limbo, the Ashanti, the Ewe, the Yoruba, and so forth, because that's demographic dynamite. But Israel's going to have to figure a way to defuse that and back off of that irrational fear, because not everyone's talking about coming to Israel, but nevertheless, they cannot deny this connection, this deep spiritual, physical, cultural, linguistic connection that African people do have to this part of the world. Geographically, we're in Africa.
Northeast Africa, indeed. Sorry, I got to run, but thank you so much. We're going to keep following this story, and we're going to keep seeing where this goes because there's a lot to unpack here. Thanks for joining me as always.